It was an ordinary afternoon in town, the kind of day when people stepped out to run errands or catch up over a warm drink. The local cafe was buzzing, filled with the soft sound of chatter and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. A teenage girl sat quietly at a corner table, her book spread out in front of her. She wasn't there to gossip or laugh loudly with friends. She was there to study focused and calm, sipping on her iced tea every now and then as she wrote notes in her notebook. Most people hardly noticed her, but one group did. A boy, known by many in town because of his wealthy family, walked in with his friends. They carried themselves with the kind of confidence that only came from privilege, speaking loudly, joking in ways that often weren't kind. He noticed the girl at the corner and smirked. For reasons only he knew, she became the target of his attention. He leaned over toward his friends and whispered something that made them laugh. And then, in a voice loud enough for others to hear, he mocked the girl's clothes. He pointed at her simple outfit, comparing it to the expensive brands he and his friends wore. His words were sharp, meant to cut, and they echoed through the cafe louder than they should have. The girl's hands froze on her pen. She heard every word. She tried to ignore him, hoping that if she stayed quiet, he would lose interest. But the boy wasn't done. He went on, mocking her shoes, her hair, even the way she quietly sat with her books. His friends laughed harder, feeding his cruelty, and the sound of their laughter stung. People at nearby tables noticed, but no one said anything. Some lowered their eyes, pretending not to hear. Others gave small, uneasy looks, but none stepped in. The girl's face grew warm, and though she didn't say a word, inside she felt the weight of embarrassment pressing down on her. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, wishing she could disappear, wishing she could be invisible for just that moment. What the boy didn't know was that her father had stepped into the cafe only minutes earlier. He stood at the counter waiting for his order, quietly watching the scene unfold. His daughter hadn't seen him yet. She was too caught up in trying to keep her head down while the boy's laughter carried across the room. The father felt his chest tighten as he watched. It wasn't the first time he had seen cruelty like this, but seeing it directed at his daughter, a child he had raised with love and care, stirred something deep inside him. He noticed how she sat frozen, how her shoulders curled in as though she was trying to make herself smaller. He could feel her pain without her saying a word. The boy, still enjoying the attention of his friends, leaned closer and said something that drew out another round of cruel laughter. The girl looked down at her notes, her pen shaking slightly in her hand. It wasn't just about clothes or shoes, it was about being singled out, about someone deciding she wasn't good enough simply because of who she was. The father took a slow breath. He could have shouted, he could have stormed across the cafe and demanded the boy stop. But instead he chose something different. He picked up his coffee when it was ready, and instead of sitting down at a table of his own, he calmly walked over to his daughter. The boy noticed him approaching but didn't stop smirking, as if expecting no consequences. The girl finally looked up, her eyes meeting her father's, and in that moment relief washed over her. She knew he had seen everything.
She didn't need to explain.
He had been there. Her father placed the coffee on her table and gently put his hand on her shoulder. His presence was steady, comforting. Then he turned his gaze toward the boy. The room seemed to shift. The laughter quieted. The boy's smirk faltered just a little, and the onlookers grew more alert. In a calm voice, not raised but strong enough for everyone to hear, the father said, "I wonder what makes someone think it's brave to tear another person down when they're just minding their own business." The words weren't harsh, but they cut deeper than shouting ever could. The boy shifted, suddenly unsure. His friends looked away, their laughter gone. The father's eyes stayed on him, steady and unwavering, and for the first time, the boy didn't have a clever comeback. The girl sat still, her heart racing not from fear anymore but from a mix of pride and surprise. She had expected her father to defend her, but not like this. He wasn't meeting cruelty with anger. He was exposing it for what it was, weakness disguised as strength. The cafe grew quieter. People who had looked away before were now watching closely. There was something about the father's calmness, his control, that commanded attention. He wasn't just defending his daughter. He was making everyone in the room think about what they had just witnessed, about their own silence, and about how easy it was to laugh along or look away instead of standing up for what was right. The boy swallowed hard, his smirk completely gone. His friends muttered something about leaving, but he stayed frozen in his chair. The father didn't raise his voice, didn't insult him, didn't even look angry. That was what made it more powerful. The silence that followed his words was heavier than any shout. The girl finally took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing just a little. She felt seen, protected. Her father gave her a reassuring look before turning back to the boy once more. "You see someone sitting quietly, working hard, not bothering anyone," he said slowly, "and instead of respecting that, you choose to make fun of them. That doesn't make you look strong. It shows everyone exactly the opposite." A hush fell over the cafe. The words sank in, not just for the boy, but for everyone watching. Some people nodded slightly, as if agreeing silently. Others looked down, embarrassed for not stepping in earlier. The boy looked down at his hands, his confidence slipping away. His friends shuffled uncomfortably in their seats, no longer laughing, no longer entertained. The father didn't need to say more. He had made his point clear, not just to the boy, but to the entire room. The girl's father finally sat down beside her, pulling her close in a quiet gesture of comfort. He didn't scold her for not speaking up. He didn't make her feel weak for staying silent. Instead, he reminded her through his actions that her worth wasn't defined by the cruel words of someone desperate for attention. The rest of the cafe carried on slowly, but the air was different now. The loud chatter didn't return right away, and the boy and his friends eventually slipped out quieter than they had entered. The girl returned to her notes, but this time her hand didn't shake. She could still feel her father's steady presence beside her, and she knew something important had just happened. What she didn't realize was that this moment, small as it seemed, would ripple far beyond the walls of that cafe. The cafe was still filled with silence after the father's calm words. People had returned to their cups and plates, but the air was different, heavier somehow. The girl sat quietly, trying to process what had just happened while her father stayed by her side. He didn't scold her, didn't question her. He simply sat there with her, sipping his coffee. It was his way of saying, "You're not alone." The boy and his friends lingered near the door for a moment. Their laughter was gone, replaced with awkward whispers. The boy, who usually carried himself with the kind of arrogance that made him seem untouchable, now looked smaller, as though the weight of those few sentences had pressed down on him. Still, he didn't apologize. He glanced back at the girl and her father once, then pushed the door open and walked out with his group trailing behind. The girl let out a shaky breath, her pen resting on the page. She could still hear the cruel laughter in her ears, but it no longer felt as sharp as before. Her father leaned toward her and said softly, "You didn't do anything wrong. Remember that." His voice was steady, warm, and filled with a kind of strength that settled her nerves. She nodded, though she didn't trust herself to speak just yet. She felt safe again, though part of her still wished the whole cafe hadn't been watching. She hated being the center of attention, and now she was sure the whispers would follow her out the door. But her father wasn't worried about the whispers. He was focused only on her. He had seen the way she shrank into herself when the boy mocked her, and he couldn't forget that look. It wasn't about pride for him. It was about making sure his daughter knew her value. He stayed with her until she finished her notes, and then they walked out together. As they left, a woman from one of the nearby tables caught the father's eye and gave him a small nod. It was a quiet gesture of respect, one that said thank you for saying what the rest of us should have. He nodded back, not needing any words. Outside, the sun was still shining as if nothing had happened. Cars passed by, people strolled with shopping bags, and the world went on. But inside the girl, something had shifted. She walked a little straighter, holding her books close to her chest. The memory of the laughter still stung, but the memory of her father standing there, calm, steady, unshaken, was stronger. As they walked toward their car, her father finally spoke again. "Sometimes silence can feel heavy," he said gently. "But silence doesn't mean weakness. You don't owe anyone your reaction. You kept your dignity, and that's more powerful than any insult." The girl nodded slowly. She had wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but her voice had been trapped by the fear of being laughed at more. Hearing her father's words, she realized she hadn't failed herself. She had chosen peace, and he had chosen to speak when she couldn't. Together, they had balanced each other. That evening at home, the girl sat at the dining table with her books again, but this time her thoughts kept drifting back to the cafe. She replayed the boy's mocking voice, the laughter of his friends, and the moment her father had stepped in, Each time, the image of her father's calm face erased the sting. Her father sat across from her reading the newspaper. He wasn't one to lecture or talk endlessly about right and wrong. He believed action spoke louder. Still, he noticed his daughter's silence and said quietly, "What happened today? It's not about you. It's about him." People who feel the need to put others down are usually the ones carrying the heaviest emptiness inside. The girl looked up at him, listening. His words were simple, but they stuck. She realized that the boy's insults weren't really about her shoes or clothes. They were about his own need to feel superior. It wasn't her weakness, it was his. Later that night, as she lay in bed, she thought about how quickly the cafe had gone silent when her father spoke. It was like everyone had been waiting for someone to say something. No one had until her father did. That thought stayed with her. Why didn't anyone else speak up? She wondered. Was it fear? Was it the same kind of fear that had kept her silent? The next day, the story began to spread. Someone who had been in the cafe posted about it online, describing the moment the father calmly stood up for his daughter. The post wasn't filled with details, it simply praised the way he had handled the situation without anger or shouting. Within hours, people began sharing it. At school, whispers had already started. Some students had seen the post, others had heard it secondhand. By lunchtime, the girl noticed people looking at her differently. Some came up and told her quietly that they admired her dad. Others simply avoided her, unsure of what to say. And then there were those who had been friends of the rich boy. They gave her cold looks, unwilling to admit that he had been wrong. She tried to ignore it all, but the truth was, her father's response had shifted something bigger than just that one moment in the cafe. People were talking, and for once the conversations weren't about fashion or gossip. They were about kindness, respect, and the courage to stand up when others stayed quiet. The boy, however, wasn't happy with the attention. For someone used to being admired and followed, the sudden wave of criticism stung. His friends no longer laughed at his jokes the same way. Some even distanced themselves, afraid of being dragged into his mess. At home, his parents heard about the incident too, and while they didn't say much in public, they weren't pleased. Their family's name was tied to wealth and reputation, and this story painted them in a light they weren't used to. Meanwhile, the girl's father carried on as usual. He went to work, came home, and treated the incident as nothing more than what it was, a moment of truth that needed to be spoken. But for the girl, it was unforgettable. She saw him differently now. Not just as her father, but as someone who had shown her the power of calm strength. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, she finally found the courage to speak. "Dad," she said softly, "why didn't you get angry? Most people would have yelled or maybe even pushed him." Her father smiled faintly. Anger can make people shut their ears. But calm words, they can't escape those. When you stay calm, the truth speaks louder than shouting ever could. She thought about that for a long moment. It was true. She had seen it with her own eyes. The boy had been silenced not because her father yelled, but because he hadn't. The calmness had exposed the boy's cruelty for everyone to see. As the days passed, the story continued to ripple through the town. People started bringing it up at community gatherings, even at church. Parents used it as an example to teach their children about respect. Some even admitted they had been guilty of looking away when they should have spoken up. The girl began to notice a small but real shift. She still carried the memory of being mocked, but now it was layered with something stronger. The memory of her father standing beside her, teaching her through example that dignity didn't come from wealth or status, but from how one treated others. The incident had started as a moment of cruelty in a cafe, but the way her father responded, calm, steady, human, had turned it into something else entirely. It was no longer just about a rich boy mocking a girl. It had become a lesson for an entire town, and though the girl didn't fully realize it yet, this was only the beginning. The following week carried a strange energy in the town. The story of the cafe incident had now spread to places far beyond that one small shop. At first, it was just whispers at school, in offices and among neighbors. But soon it started making its way into community meetings, family dinner conversations, and even local news blogs. People were talking, and everyone had their own version of the story. For the girl, life felt different. Wherever she went, she could feel eyes on her. Some were filled with quiet admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with discomfort. She hadn't asked for any of this attention. She had simply been sitting with her books trying to study, when everything happened, but now she had become a part of something bigger. One afternoon at school, a teacher stopped her in the hallway. The teacher leaned down and said softly, "I just want you to know, what your father did was brave. You should be proud." The girl smiled shyly, not knowing how to respond. It was strange. She hadn't done anything herself. Yet people were treating her differently because of her father's calm words. At the same time, the boy who had mocked her was dealing with a very different kind of attention. For years he had been used to being at the center of things, the one people admired or followed simply because of his family name and money. But now, whenever he walked down the hallways, there were whispers. Some students avoided him, while others stared with folded arms, no longer laughing at his jokes. He tried to pretend none of it bothered him, but inside it was eating away at him. The girl noticed it too. She saw how his group of friends had thinned, how his voice wasn't as loud as before, and how his smirk appeared less often. But she didn't take joy in it. She wasn't looking for revenge. She simply wanted peace, a chance to exist without being mocked. Still, she couldn't deny that watching the tables turn felt like justice in its own quiet way. Meanwhile, her father continued with his life as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He went to work in the mornings, came home in the evenings, and still found time to sit with his daughter to ask about her schoolwork. But people in town had started to see him differently. Neighbors nodded to him with more respect. Strangers shook his hand. At the grocery store, someone even stopped to say, "The way you handled that boy. That's how it should be done." He didn't let it get to his head. He smiled politely, thanked people for their kind words, and carried on. To him, it hadn't been about making a scene or becoming an example. It had been about his daughter, and about teaching a boy that cruelty wasn't strength. But still, he could sense that something had begun to shift. One evening after dinner, the girl asked her father a question that had been sitting heavy in her heart. "Do you think people respect me now only because of what happened? Not because of me, but because of what you said?" Her father looked at her for a moment, then shook his head gently. "Respect that comes from truth will always last. People may have noticed me that day, but what they will see sooner or later is you. They'll see your work, your kindness, your effort. That's what will speak louder than anything I could say." His words comforted her, but deep inside she still carried a mix of emotions: pride, confusion, and a little fear. She wasn't sure how long the attention would last or what it would mean for her future. A few days later, another moment unfolded that pushed the story further. The local community center had organized a youth event, inviting families, teachers, and students to come together. It was meant to be a day of fun and learning, with speeches about respect, teamwork, and leadership. The girl hadn't planned to attend, but her father encouraged her. "It's good to show up," he said with a smile. When they arrived, the atmosphere was lively. Children played in one corner, parents chatted in groups, and volunteers handed out food. But soon the event's main session began, and people gathered to listen to short talks from community members. One by one, speakers came up to share their thoughts about respect and kindness. Then, unexpectedly, one of the organizers asked the girl's father if he would like to say a few words. The room grew quiet as he stood up. He hadn't prepared anything, but he walked to the front with the same calm presence he had shown in the cafe. He didn't give a long speech. He simply told the story of that day from his point of view. He explained how painful it had been to watch someone try to humiliate his daughter, and how easy it would have been to react with anger. But instead he chose calm words because, as he put it, anger only teaches fear while calm teaches truth. The room listened in silence. Parents nodded. Some teenagers looked at each other, realizing that the story they had heard whispered in hallways was being told in full, right in front of them. The girl sat at the back, her heart pounding, but she felt proud. Hearing her father speak so openly, she realized this moment wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone in the room. When he finished, the applause was steady, not loud or forced, but heartfelt. People respected the honesty in his words. He returned to his seat quietly, never seeking praise, and placed his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. But as much as the town admired the father, the boy who had caused it all felt cornered. At school, he overheard classmates saying things like, "Did you hear her dad? He's right, that boy went too far." Each word cut him, and though he wanted to defend himself, deep down he knew it was true. Still, pride is a heavy thing. Instead of apologizing, he grew more distant. He walked the halls with his head down, speaking less, trying to avoid the stares. The silence that followed him was heavier than laughter had ever been. Back at home, the girl noticed the changes too. She saw how the town was slowly beginning to talk more openly about respect, about privilege, about kindness. Her father's calm response had started a conversation that wasn't stopping. Some people resisted it, dismissing it as just another story that would fade away, but others believed it was the start of something real. One night, while sitting on her bed, the girl thought about everything. She remembered how small she had felt in the cafe, how heavy the laughter had been. Then she remembered her father's steady words, the way the room had gone silent and how the story had grown beyond her. It felt strange, but in a good way, to see how one moment of cruelty had turned into something that made people think. She realized that her father hadn't just defended her. He had taught her and everyone else watching that dignity didn't need to shout. It simply needed to stand firm. And though the story was far from over, she could already sense that the truth of who she was and who her father had shown himself to be would last much longer than the sting of mockery ever could. The story of the cafe incident had now become something much larger than anyone had expected. What started as a boy mocking a girl in front of strangers had turned into a topic people could not stop discussing. The town was small and news traveled fast, but this wasn't like gossip that came and went. This was different. It was sparking real conversations, the kind that made people pause and look at themselves. At the community center, at schools, in shops, even at church, the same theme kept coming up: respect. Parents told their children about what happened, teachers used it as an example in class, and community leaders mentioned it in meetings. It wasn't about fame or attention. It was about how one person's calm stand had reminded everyone of something important. The girl noticed the shift too. Walking through the halls at school, she overheard classmates talking about kindness and dignity in ways they never had before. Some even admitted quietly that they had been too quick to laugh at jokes like the boys in the past, and now they were rethinking it. For her, it was strange to see her life become a kind of lesson for others, but at the same time she felt proud of what her father had done. At the same time, the boy who had started it all was dealing with consequences he had never faced before. He wasn't used to silence when he walked into a room. He wasn't used to being the subject of whispers that didn't sound like admiration but sounded like judgment. At first he tried to brush it off, pretending it didn't bother him. He told himself people were jealous, that they would move on. But as the days stretched into weeks, he realized the story wasn't fading. It was growing. One afternoon, he walked into the school cafeteria and found a group of students sitting at his usual table. They didn't move when he arrived. Instead, they looked at him with calm eyes, as though silently telling him he didn't own the space. For the first time, he sat down alone at another table. That feeling of being unwanted, of being left out, was one he had never experienced before, and it cut deeper than he expected. Meanwhile, in the girl's home, life felt steadier. Her father didn't dwell on the incident. He didn't bring it up every day, nor did he let the attention from others change him. He continued to guide his daughter the way he always had, with patience, quiet strength, and small lessons hidden in ordinary conversations. But still, he could see how the moment had left its mark on her. She carried herself differently now. Not with arrogance, but with a deeper sense of worth. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, the girl asked her father something that had been sitting on her heart. "Why do you think the whole town is talking about this?" "You only said a few words." Her father thought for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes it's not about how many words you say. It's about when you choose to say them. Most people stay silent when they see wrong. They don't want trouble. They don't want to stand out. So when someone finally does speak, even with just a few words, it echoes." She nodded slowly, realizing how true that was. The silence in the cafe that day had been proof of it. Dozens of people had heard the boy mocking her, but only her father had spoken. And because of that, the memory of his words had spread far beyond that room. The real change came when the local newspaper decided to write about the story. It wasn't just a short piece. It was a thoughtful article about respect, privilege, and the quiet power of standing up without anger. The article didn't mention names, but everyone in town knew who it was about. By the next morning, copies of the paper were everywhere, and people couldn't stop discussing it. Some praised the father for setting an example. Others admitted it made them uncomfortable because it forced them to face their own silence. But either way, the conversations kept spreading. Soon, even nearby towns began to share the story. At school, the girl was invited by one of her teachers to speak at an assembly. She hesitated at first. Speaking in front of a crowd made her nervous. But then she remembered her father's calmness, how he had faced the boy without fear, and she decided to try. On the day of the assembly, the auditorium was full. Students whispered as she walked to the stage. Her hands shook, but when she looked out and saw her father sitting quietly in the back, her fear eased. She spoke in a soft voice at first, telling her classmates what it felt like to be mocked in public, how heavy silence can feel, and how much her father's words had lifted her in that moment. She didn't try to sound wise or polished. She simply told the truth. And as she spoke, the room grew quiet, just like the cafe had that day. When she finished, the applause was real, not forced. Students clapped because they felt her words, because they recognized themselves in her story. Some had been mocked before, and some had been the ones laughing. She had reached them all. Her father watched with pride, though he didn't show it with big gestures. He simply nodded at her when she returned to her seat, a quiet signal that she had done well. The boy, who had been sitting in the crowd, felt a mix of emotions. Shame burned in him, but so did something else, regret. For the first time, he wondered if maybe he had gone too far, if maybe the cruelty he had thought was harmless fun had actually left deeper wounds. He didn't know how to fix it, and his pride kept him from walking up to her right then. But the thought lingered. Back in town, the story continued to ripple outward. Local leaders started discussing youth programs to encourage respect and empathy. Churches began sermons on kindness. Even parents began reminding their children not just to avoid cruelty, but also to speak up when they saw it. The father's calm response had turned into more than a moment. It was becoming a movement. The girl noticed the change too. At the grocery store, strangers smiled at her. At school, students who had once ignored her now said hello. She didn't let it get to her head, but she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't before. At home, her father reminded her, "Attention comes and goes. Don't let it define you. What matters is that you keep your dignity, no matter what others say or do." She held on to those words tightly. But while the town was changing, the boy struggled more each day. He couldn't escape the whispers, the stares, or the feeling that he had lost something important: respect. For someone who had built his identity on being admired, the loss was crushing. He thought often about the girl and her father, about how calm words had turned his laughter into silence. And though he didn't admit it to anyone, he knew deep down he owed them both something he had never given before: an apology. The stage was being set for another moment, one that would test whether he could swallow his pride, or whether he would let his silence become heavier than his cruelty had been. The days turned into weeks, and the story still lived in the town's conversations. By now, everyone knew about the cafe incident, and most had formed their own opinion on it. Some people saw it as a reminder of how cruelty could be challenged without anger. Others saw it as a lesson about privilege and kindness. For the girl, though, it was more personal. It had changed how she saw herself. She no longer walked with her head down. She no longer feared the whispers in the hallway at school. She knew now that silence didn't make her weak. And dignity wasn't about winning arguments. It was about carrying yourself with self-respect. No matter what others said, her father noticed the difference in her too. She studied with more focus, spoke with more confidence, and smiled more freely. He was proud, but he didn't tell her this every day. He wanted her strength to grow from within, not from constant praise. Still, he made sure she always knew he was there, steady as ever, ready to guide her when she needed it. But while life seemed brighter for the girl, the boy who had mocked her was still weighed down. He couldn't escape the stares. Every time he entered a room, he felt as if people were judging him, even when they weren't. The laughter that used to follow him wherever he went was gone. The power he had once felt over others had vanished. At first, he tried to fight it by pretending he didn't care. He walked with his shoulders squared, trying to look confident. But inside, he knew the truth. His actions had left a stain, and nothing he did could erase it. The only way forward was to face it, and deep down he knew exactly what that meant. The thought of apologizing scared him. He wasn't used to admitting he was wrong. In his world, money and status had always shielded him from consequences. But this was different. This was about respect, and no amount of wealth could buy it back. One morning, after weeks of wrestling with himself, he made a decision. He didn't know if the girl would forgive him or if the town would care, but he knew he had to try. He couldn't carry the weight of silence any longer. At school, he approached her quietly during lunch. She was sitting with a small group of friends, laughing softly about something. For a moment, he almost turned around, afraid of embarrassing himself. But then he remembered the look on her face in the cafe that day, the quiet pain she had felt. That memory pushed him forward. He cleared his throat and the table grew silent. All eyes turned to him. His usual confidence was gone, replaced with nervousness he couldn't hide. He looked at the girl and said, I need to say something. The cafeteria hushed. Students nearby leaned in, curious. The boy's voice shook slightly as he continued. What I did that day was wrong. I thought it was funny. I thought it made me look strong. But it didn't. It only showed how weak I was. I embarrassed you in front of everyone and I hurt you. I can't take it back, but I'm sorry. The room stayed quiet. For a moment, the girl didn't know what to say. She hadn't expected this. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw that his pride had finally cracked. His words weren't perfect, but they were honest. She took a breath and replied simply, I accept your apology. But remember, words matter. Don't use them to tear people down again. The boy nodded, his shoulders sinking with relief. He didn't expect her to smile or forgive him instantly, but hearing her say those words lifted something heavy off his chest. For the first time in weeks, he felt like maybe he could start again. Word of his apology spread quickly. By the end of the day, the entire school was talking about it. Some students were surprised, others skeptical, but most agreed it had taken courage. The boy's reputation wasn't magically fixed, but the act of admitting his mistake softened the judgment against him. It showed he was capable of change. At home, the girl told her father what had happened. He listened quietly, then asked, And how did you feel when he apologized? She thought about it for a moment before answering. Lighter, she said softly. Not because I needed his apology, but because it reminded me that even people who hurt others can change. Her father smiled faintly. That's the lesson, isn't it? Strength isn't about never making mistakes. It's about admitting them and learning from them. The weeks that followed brought more change to the town. Inspired by the cafe story, schools began introducing workshops about respect and kindness. Community leaders started programs that encouraged young people to speak up when they saw wrong being done. Parents reminded their children about the power of words. Slowly but surely, the town's atmosphere began to shift. The girl and her father didn't seek attention for any of this. They lived quietly, as they always had. But people still looked at them with a certain respect, not because they wanted fame, but because their calmness had left a lasting impression. For the boy, life wasn't easy after his apology. He still had to earn back trust. But over time, people noticed the change in him. He stopped mocking others. He became quieter, more thoughtful. He even began volunteering at the community center, hoping to prove with actions what words had started. The girl saw these changes from a distance. She didn't become his friend, but she no longer carried bitterness toward him. She had learned something important, that holding on to anger only keeps wounds open. But letting go allows healing, even if it's slow. As months passed, the cafe incident became more than just a story people repeated. It became part of the town's identity, a reminder of what respect and dignity looked like. Parents told their children about it as if it were a lesson, not just an event. Teachers used it to show that silence isn't always golden, and sometimes one calm voice can change everything. The girl often thought about that day too. At first, it had been one of the most painful experiences of her life, but over time it became a turning point, one that made her stronger. She realized that dignity isn't something anyone can take away. It lives within and it grows stronger each time you choose not to let cruelty define you. Her father remained her guide, always steady, always calm. When people continued to praise him, he would shake his head and say, "It wasn't about me. It was about doing what was right in that moment." But the town knew it was more than that. His choice had sparked a change, not only in his daughter's life, but in the lives of many. And so the story ended not with anger, not with division, but with growth. A cruel act had been met with calm strength. A boy had faced his pride and chosen to apologize. A girl had found her voice and her dignity. And a father had shown an entire town that true power lies not in wealth or loudness, but in the courage to stand calmly for what is right. The cafe moment faded into memory, but its lesson remained. It lived on in conversations, in classrooms, and in the quiet choices people made every day. The town was not the same because one man's calm response had lit a spark that no one could put out.